I'm going to go ahead and get started. And we are beginning a new series. So we just finished last week Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I hope all of you got a copy of this. If you haven't, you should get a copy. People ask me sometimes, because I read a lot, if I had to pick 10 books everybody should read in their lifetime, what should they read? 10 books is tough. Maybe top 20. Maybe in the top 20, this book I would recommend. It's not. Well, what are the other 19? So if I'm just going off the top of my, no, that's like a perfect question. Like, if I'm going off the top of my head, obviously the Bible is there, though technically speaking, the Bible is not a book. It's a library of books from ancient Israel up through the early church, but certainly the Bible. I've probably read Homer's Iliad dozens of times, and I think that it is inexhaustible. Plato's philosophy is up there. St. Augustine's Confessions is certainly, I began reading St. Augustine's Confessions like a lot of young men in the 7th grade. No, that's a joke. I did begin reading it in the 7th grade, but it's just like, no, I was on a different track than the other kids I was growing up with. St. Augustine's Confessions, certainly. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica has been an incredible source of wisdom and help to me over the years. Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authorship from probably either or volumes 1 and 2, and then Stages on Life's Way, I think, are among the great pieces of literature ever written. So Virgil's Aeneid. I think Virgil's Aeneid is incredible. Dante's Divine Comedy. Everybody talks about the Inferno, but the Divine Comedy has 3 parts, and Dante is certainly worth reading. Milton's Paradise Lost. John Milton's Paradise Lost, a Puritan kind of epic. Incredible poetry. And many people, even in Milton's day, argued about whether Milton or Shakespeare was the greatest poet of their time. Shakespeare is certainly great. And I would say Shakespeare outpaces Milton in terms of literary ability, but I would say Milton probably outpaces Shakespeare in terms of depth. That's an opinion. So certainly Milton, and what else could I say? I got Plato, Homer, Virgil, Milton, Kierkegaard, Viktor Frankl, C.S. Lewis's works in the 20th century, his apologetic as well as his other literary works are incredibly valuable and have a depth. C.S. Lewis has a depth that slides past most people because he writes children's books. But they're deep. They are incredibly deep. So he's certainly up there.
About his guy that George
Orwell?
No. No, the guy that influenced C.S. Lewis. I'm trying to think. George MacDonald.
Oh, George MacDonald. You know, I've only read one work by George MacDonald. He was a big influence on C.S. Lewis, and the only thing I ever read by him was The Princess and the Goblin, which is a fantasy, and I thought it was great. Really, really good. So, yeah.
C.S. Lewis, I read just something by C.S. Lewis just last night. He called MacDonald his master. He quotes him a lot. There's also the guy that wrote his buddy, his Inkling buddy.
Everybody's heard of Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Well, no, he says MacDonald was his
Yeah.
influence too. So.
George MacDonald is a lesser well-known, I think he's Scottish, literary artist. who inspired both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
Lewis liked MacDonald's sermons.
And a lot of his sermons are preserved. Yeah, you can read the transcript of George MacDonald's sermons. So he was a powerful influence. I kind of group them together as sort of the British, George MacDonald's Scottish, but they're in the British Isles. Huge influence. But those are some of the books that I would say that I read and I reread and I reread and I never get to the bottom of. There's a few great things in life that you can never get to the bottom of. Chess, the game of chess for me is one of them. No matter how good you are, there's always somebody better, and the well goes deep. Chess is just a great game. I don't play it that much, but tennis, apparently, which is more athletic than chess, is one of those too. Certain books that you just never get to the bottom of. Certain pieces of music are rich. Many of the classical composers have written pieces that they're so rich, you just hear something new and fresh every time you listen to them. And it's not that all other music is bad, but they're in a category by themselves. You know, those are special pieces of music.
A well-known author said that if he lived 1,000 years, he still wouldn't get to the bottom of the Beethoven string quartets.
Beethoven's one of them, certainly, the string quartets, and Mozart is another. Certainly Bach and Brahms. You know, Brahms spent over 10 to 15 years just writing his first symphony, and I consider that an incredible piece of music, particularly the fourth movement and the first movement. So there are fine literary and artistic works that have a depth that, and again, it's not that other cultural products aren't worth the time. Sure, I buy a Big Mac like anybody else from time to time. But a Big Mac is not fine cuisine, you know, and so sometimes you want to savor the greatness of a thing, and so you reach for something more. So that's a good question. I fired off about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and you asked a good question about what else I would put up there. Those are definitely some of the works that I think are truly great. This series we're going to begin on Romans. Speaking of great works, I use here in the lesson on page 2 the Latin phrase magnum opus, which TJ knows means
Great work.
the great work. Okay, so many people have their magnum opus, and that means that, you know, literary and artistic and musical and other people and even theologians produce lots of works, but Romans is often considered Paul's great work. So he wrote a lot of letters, and we have them in our New Testament. But Romans is generally considered the great one, and it has been incredibly influential in the history of the church, Western civilization, and in the lives of some very powerful and prominent Christians throughout the centuries. So I call it a magnum opus. Now, what's probably important about Romans is that in most of Paul's letters, maybe we're reading the New Testament, maybe we're doing a Bible study, there's Philippians and Ephesians and Colossians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In a lot of Paul's letters, you'll notice that he immediately engages with what's going on in a particular church. Maybe there's a moral issue that's going on or a theological issue that's going on, and so especially in the Corinthian letters, he digs down into those particular issues. But he did not found the church at Rome. And so one of the important things about the Roman letter is that they don't know him, not like the churches that he founded. And so now in this letter, and it occurs at the end of his career, when he has reached, so to speak, his mature thinking about the gospel, he has to present to them what he's been preaching. And so one of the reasons why Romans is his magnum opus is precisely because it occurs in his mature years after he's thought and wrestled with the gospel for many decades. And he's presenting to a church that doesn't know him, this is what I do. This is what I preach. And so Romans has become, for many Christians, kind of the place to go when we're working through Paul. And Paul wrote this probably, let's see, the Roman church began in the 40s, and Paul wrote it probably around the 50s. We're dealing with this a little bit in the ancient and medieval history classes I'm teaching at the school, but in the centuries that would follow, the whole Roman Empire had become Christian. And I don't think we fully appreciate the magnitude of that event. For thousands of years, ancient peoples had been worshiping various gods. The sun, the moon, the stars, love, hate, war. So the things of nature, the things of the human psyche, what Paul calls in Romans the created things. They worship the created things. And within a couple centuries, the whole Roman Empire, which is the premier civilization of its day, becomes Christian. That's an incredible movement. And if you go down to the DIA or the Art Museum and you look at the artwork, you'll notice a huge shift when you go from the ancient art section to the medieval art section. All of a sudden, every painting, every statue, every book has pictures of Jesus, the apostles, the Virgin Mary. You have the conversion of not only a civilization, but the premier civilization of the whole ancient world becomes Christian. And so Paul's letter to the Romans is part of that. Even if I was not a Christian, and I am a Christian, but even if I wasn't a Christian, I would still have to, as a historian, come to grips with this event. What happened? Thousands of years of tradition from India to China to Greece to Rome to all of these ancient civilizations comes to center upon Jesus Christ. And he becomes the master, so to speak, of all of man's religious and moral aspirations. Everybody across dozens of civilizations bows the knee to Christ. What on earth happened here? And Paul is very important in that story because he is probably more than any of the other early Christians the one who carries the gospel outside the Jewish community. Jesus was a Jew. The apostles were Jews. But Paul is carrying it to non-Jewish people. And it is through him that it reaches the ancient world. Now, I'll stop periodically and see if there's any questions, but that's my introduction. Pretty good, huh? Yeah, that was pretty good.
Just about a week ago, listening to James Boyce,
Yes.
he made a statement on Romans that says he would put it up comparable with Homer and Plato as far as the been like that if he didn't, as a writer?
Well, there's no doubt. Some people have said Romans is one of the great works that have ever appeared in human history. And I would agree with that. So I mentioned sort of my top 20 works or so forth. But Paul definitely belongs up there. He is one of the great minds of the first century. Religiously, intellectually, spiritually, he's one of the great minds of the first century. Romans is his magnum opus. And so, yeah, Romans, if I was just trying to educate people, in addition to Plato and Homer and Aristotle and Virgil, they would need to read Romans. And probably of the Gospels, they at least would need to read John. Because Christianity is a power. And Paul says that in the letter to the Romans. It's not just an idea, but it's a power that changes people, changes groups, changes civilizations. And it certainly is. And it certainly belongs up there.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that and appreciate the fact that God chose fishermen to be his disciples.
Yeah.
And
Even worse than fishermen,
tax collectors.
women. Even
I think it's brilliant that he goes and makes the lowly things of the world to shame the wise and everything. But at the same time, I think it's a wonderful move that he got someone like Paul, or in the Old Testament, got someone like Moses, who was the king's kid, the God's kid at the time,
yeah.
to be such an influential person there, and Paul to be such an influential person here.
Well, I have to talk about that. You're quite right, because Paul is a highly educated Roman citizen and a Jew who hates Christianity and condemns and even presides over the execution of Christians. So any historian has to wrestle with the issue of what happened. How did Christianity's greatest enemy suddenly become its greatest advocate? Now, you can wrestle with the road to Damascus story. He fell from his horse and a voice spoke to him, and, but even if a modern historian dismisses that, says, well, I don't believe that, that's too supernatural. What other story are you going to give? Something happened to transform Christianity's greatest opponent into its greatest advocate. So Paul is a very interesting character. And I will say this, we're anticipating in the lesson here, he's also very important for what the early Christians believed. We've all heard the story that Jesus was this guy over here, and the church transformed him into this guy over there, right? If you haven't heard that, it'll be on the television. Nobody listens to television anymore, especially now. But Paul wrote his letters within a decade plus of the life of Christ. Galatians and other letters that he wrote. Galatians is probably the earliest. But that's an important letter because he would not have executed so many Christians if he wasn't opposed to their beliefs. And he testifies to what it is that they were saying in that letter particularly. So those who want to say that Christianity as we know it today was a social construct that took several centuries to develop are in a difficult spot, primarily because of Paul. And Paul's letters are the earliest documents in the New Testament. They're earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Technically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the Gospels. Those tell us about Jesus, but they were written after the time of Paul. So Paul's letters are the earliest documents in the New Testament, and one of the reasons why he's important to historians is because on the one hand, he hated Christianity and tried to stamp it out. Then he became a convert. But to that extent, he is our best witness of what the early Christians were saying. And he makes it very clear in his earliest letters that they were saying that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what he attacked. So that can't really be a late construct after the fact, if that makes sense. So even from a non-Christian point of view, just from a historical point of view, Paul is important because he is our earliest witness to what it is Christians were saying about Jesus. And that's important because we all sort of live in a kind of evolutionary way of thinking where things develop gradually, minutesimally over time. Fine, very well and good. I'm no great enemy of evolution myself. But the theory can't drive the facts. Facts are tough things. And Paul is in this letter to the Romans and in his other letters, we get the idea that the early Christians very, very quickly were spreading the news that Jesus was God risen from the dead. And that's very clear in his letters. So that's important. That's important. A few people I mention here on page 2 who were powerfully moved by this letter and whose names have gone down in history. Augustine, St. Augustine, John Wesley, Martin Luther, I got them out of order, and then Karl Barth are the probably 4 most important theologians throughout history who have been profoundly moved by this letter. St. Augustine was a pagan. He had a Christian mother named Monica from North Africa, and his father was a pagan Roman civilian, and he really resisted becoming a Christian much of his young life. If you read his Confessions, I mentioned Augustine's Confessions as one of the great works of Western Civ. I think that it is. And even though it was written in the 300s, it's so relevant to our time. One of the main reasons why Augustine resisted Christianity is sex. He just loved sex so much. He felt that becoming a Christian would ruin his life. And you rarely encounter ancient writers who are that frank and honest about what really prevented them from becoming a Christian. And he says it out, you know. I remember reading him as a middle schooler. Good time to read St. Augustine. You know, right when puberty hits, right? And I thought, well, this guy is wrestling with something, you know. And Romans was the text. He read a text from Romans during his conversion experience. It just was very, very powerful for him. And he talks about that in his Confessions. Martin Luther, breaking away from the high medieval church, Romans was his primary inspiration. John Wesley, after the Protestants did, and even still to, I would say to the present day, make everything in religion about dogma, doctrine, beliefs. Romans was an important thing that moved John Wesley toward the idea that religious experience and practice and fellowship with God is pretty darn important. And it's not enough just to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and wag fingers at them, tell them how they're all works-based, and now we're all faith-based. For John Wesley, religion is a matter of the heart. We have to feel and experience God's work in our life. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Karl Barth in Germany, when most Christians in Germany were siding with Hitler and had identified religion with political conservatism and the movement that Hitler was developing there in Germany, Romans was a powerful force in the life of Karl Barth, that faithfulness to Christ and political alignment were not the same thing. And so he was a powerful voice. So Romans has had Paul wrote it a long time ago, but it's had a powerful impact on people ever since. And the four that I would say here in the lesson, biggest: Augustine, Luther, Wesley, Barth. Now, many of you don't know Karl Barth as well because he wrote in the early 20th century. And it does take a while for theologians and scholarly works to trickle down to the churches. So academics know about it, but church people don't. I got a big footnote here on Karl Barth, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but let me see if there's any question or comment about that before I go in. Yeah, Charlie.
Did John Wesley believe you could lose your salvation?
Yes. So John Wesley, the question was, did he believe you could lose your salvation? And the answer I gave is, yes, he did. So John Wesley became a controversial figure because technically he was an Anglican priest. He belonged to the Anglican Church, and so faith alone within the Protestant movement was the standing idea. But John Wesley, in the course of his time, really embraced the ideas of Jacob Arminius, who opposed John Calvin. And Jacob Arminius would pretty much have been kind of shoved away in human history if it hadn't been for John Wesley. John Wesley had the idea that faith inspires good works, and that good works retroactively confirm one's faith. So he occupied a kind of uncomfortable middle ground between classical Catholicism and continental Protestantism. But what's probably most important about John Wesley is that he did his missions work in America. And so while the 13 American colonies on the East Coast were all tidily Lutheran, Calvinist, and Anglican, John Wesley and the circuit rider preachers who followed him pushed west into the frontier, and they became preachers. And so much of America, in what they call the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s, became Arminian, which is the idea that faith first, yes, but good works validate faith retroactively. And John Wesley had another doctrine that he added of his own that became the foundation of the holiness churches and Pentecostalism, which is that people can, in the present life, achieve moral perfection. And that's what caused the big controversy. Now, what that did for the Americas in the 1800s is it created a huge movement of moral energy and zeal and progress sweeping into the western frontier. But it also brought problems. And we are the inheritors of that wonderful legacy. Yeah.
So most Methodist churches today are on the very liberal spectrum, aren't they?
Yes.
I think Wesley would not be too happy. I don't know, but it would seem to me that he would not be in agreement with a lot of objections.
I don't think Wesley would approve of what contemporary Methodist churches are doing. But he was certainly a liberal force for his time. The Wesleyan Methodists were the first churches in the Americas to ordain women as pastors. Now, that's a big deal. especially in the 1800s. That's when the women's movement begins. Right to vote, and things like that. So Methodism becomes kind of the progressive liberal wing of Christianity in the 1800s. Now, Methodism as it exists today has far outrun anything Wesley ever would have gone with. But at the time, yeah, it was definitely the Wild West liberal wing of Christianity. They're the ones who held the tent revivals and spoke in tongues and rolled around on the ground and had miraculous services. And many of the great evangelists of the 19th and 20th century come out of that, like Charles Finney in the late 1800s, and what was the other one? What's that? Billy Sunday, definitely. He was in the television days. Billy Sunday, Ira Sankey, and Bob Jones, and then all the way to Billy Graham. The great mass evangelistic movement of the second, and sometimes people say the third Great Awakening, comes out of that. And it won a whole Western frontier for Christianity, but it won it for a more liberal form of Christianity than Calvinism or Lutheranism. And so in our present situation, most of those churches align themselves with sort of the liberal political movements that you're talking about. I think that's what you're getting at, and that's true. Yeah. All right, so historical introduction, page 2. I'll come back next week and talk about Karl Barth because, again, Karl Barth is the most important theologian of the 20th century. Important doesn't mean we have to agree with everything that he says. Important means influential. He has had an incredible influence. I have charity of my father and mother, all 13 volumes of his church dogmatics in my personal library at home. They bought that for me for Christmas. Thank you. I've read every last one with my highlighting and my notes and everything. Whew. It's long. And he never finished it. He died before he could actually finish all of the writing that he did there. But it's very forward-thinking. It's very energetic. And it's the great theological work of the 20th century. Yeah.
I read I don't know where I read this, maybe the church made some official statement. They said that they thought that this was he's Reformed, Karl Barth.
He's technically a Calvinist, though Calvinists often say, no.
Some of the church's scholars believe that was the greatest theological work since Thomas Aquinas.
Of what?
Greatest theological accomplishment since Thomas Aquinas.
I would agree with that. Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics is the greatest theological accomplishment since Aquinas' Summa Theologica of the High Middle Ages. I think that's correct. And even if one disagrees with different parts of it, you have to deal with it. It's not going to go away. And in many ways, it's a very forward-thinking work. It's not, strictly speaking, Orthodox Catholic or even Protestant, which is why he gets into trouble. It pushes beyond the traditional arguments that divide Orthodox Catholics and Protestants. So it's a mighty work. It's a mighty work and worthy of consideration. And he began his career with the book of Romans. That's what he began with. Paul's letter to the Romans was written in amidst of a number of important events. Caesar Augustus had inaugurated his dictatorship at 27 BC, and that will continue through 14 AD. We will hear about that today in the service, because one of my sons is going to say, during the reign of Caesar Augustus, a decree was issued that a census should be taken of the Roman people. Joseph, who was of the house of David, went down to Bethlehem to register for the census with his wife Mary, who was with child. So this is a very Christmas appropriate thing to draw attention to. Over on page 3, the church is going to appear after Jesus' 3-year ministry. And nobody in history ever had a 2 to 3 year ministry that had a greater impact than Jesus. I mean, people have ministries for decades, and it doesn't transform civilizations globally, worldwide. Jesus only, if you think about it, 2 to 3 years. That's pretty much all that he did, and the world has never gotten over it. First among the Jews in Jerusalem, but then the issue here is that Christianity begins to spread to non-Jews. And that's a big deal, and that's going to come out in the letter to the Romans. Paul particularly, who was himself a Jew, believes in the religion of the Jews, the God of Israel, and yet he thinks that through Jesus, the God of Israel is now going to become the God of every other nation on earth. And that is the basis of his ministry, his activity. So Paul is on the forefront of that. And from there it spreads. Now you do have early Christian leaders like James, who is Jesus' own half-brother, who led the church in Jerusalem, and they were good old-fashioned Jews. They observed the food laws, they observed the festivals, they sacrificed animals, they did everything that you have in the law of Moses, the early parts of the Old Testament. Paul wasn't against that, but he was busy doing other things. Once he crossed, the famous story when he's in Asia Minor and he has the vision of the man from Macedonia calling him, and then he crosses the Hellespont, and then he's in Greece. And he's preaching the gospel to pagan Greeks. And for Paul, what becomes the scandal, one of the scandals of the gospel, is that these pagan Greeks are just receiving the message of Christ, and so few of his Jewish brothers and sisters are. Some of them are, but most Jews push away against the gospel, and then most Jews accept it. So Paul's on that uncomfortable dividing line. And so he preaches to every corner of the Mediterranean. Barbarian. Paul generally divides people up into 3 groups at this point: Jew, Greek, and barbarian. And you find it in the letters. There's Jews who are the inheritors of the great religious tradition of the past. There's the Greeks who are the elites, the intellectually educated, sophisticated elites, and the barbarians. Every white face in this room is descended from the North German barbarians, probably, that toppled the ancient world and are the source of the Middle Ages. We were not sophisticated. And people like St. Gregory the Great had to educate us into Christianity, because we were just a bunch of warriors and blokes. But we were good fighters. Good fighters. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the greatest defeats the Roman army ever experienced. So when the German barbarians crossed the Danube and the Rhine into the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire was not able to withstand them. So there they are. But they weren't Christians they believed in They were pagans. They have the same religion as the Greeks and the Romans. They didn't believe in Zeus and Poseidon and Hades. But anybody who watches Marvel superhero movies knows that it's all about Odin and Thor. And I don't know, who are the other characters in the popular movies these days? You watch these things. The Incredible Hulk is not part of Norse myth.
What a shame. Loki?
There you go, Loki. We'll go with Loki. I'll give you Loki. I do have to remind the students from time to time that the Incredible Hulk is not part of Norse myth. Because they always see him fighting Thor in some sort of arena in Marvel superhero movies. Paul was a young Pharisee. So that's a sect of Judaism. He was a vigorous opponent of Christianity. And I preached a little bit last week in my sermon. You know, if you read the Old Testament, one of the things I got out of reading the Old Testament is how the Israelite people never really got used to monotheism. They just never got used to it. They had been 400 years in Egypt. They were polytheists. There's these laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and in Exodus against worshiping other gods. And for us today, it's like, well, okay, that's obvious. But I don't really think we appreciate how hard this was for them. They never were able to do it. When you get to the end of the Old Testament, the Israelite people are worshiping all kinds of other gods. It's part of the culture. It's just the air that they breathe. They were never able to shrug that off. And it wasn't that they were against Yahweh, but it was Yahweh and. Yahweh and Asherah, Yahweh and Baal, Yahweh and these other deities, More is better.
Cover your bases.
What's that?
Cover your bases.
Yeah, cover your bases. Even Paul says in his speech to the Athenians, you got a statue to an unknown God just in case anybody feels left out. That's the old way of thinking. And I remember my daughter, Rachel, she had a Hindu friend named Mridula back in kindergarten, and I visited Mridula's house, and her Hindu father showed me his shrine with all of his deities. He had these little statues and things, and I was fascinated. This is really cool. I wish I had one of these. And Jesus was in there too. We got all of these gods, and he's like, we're good Christians. I said, oh, well, that's great. It says, Jesus is here. He's with all the other deities. We have a place for him. Oh, well, I loved it. I thought it was so sweet. But as a Christian, I'm like, no, that's not exactly how it works. The God of Israel is jealous, exclusive. And that's a bad word in our time, right? Exclusivity. He's exclusive. Me and me alone, and so I didn't challenge him at that. I was just a guest in his house. But the Israelites never got over that. And so Paul and the early Pharisees, after the catastrophe at the end of the Old Testament, said, this is never going to happen again. We are monotheists. We are going to be pure. We are going to be moral. We are going to build this people up that failed so terribly, and we will bring in the days of the Messiah. And I'm incredibly sympathetic with that. It's, when Paul was murdering Christians, he must have been thinking, here we go again. After all the catastrophes of the last several centuries, now these people are saying that Jesus of Nazareth is God. This is the same thing over again. We have to stamp this out. I'm very sympathetic. That would have been me. I would have been like, absolutely, this is stupid. there's no way that this crucified criminal is, the God of Israel. This is just another pagan belief. And Paul opposed it with all of his energy and might. He thought that it was wrong. It was just another example of the Jewish people being taken in by foreign religious ideas and being led down the garden path. So I think that's a very interesting feature of Paul, because what that does for him is it gives him a foot in the door with the Jews. One of the things that makes C.S. Lewis a great apologist, people mention the name C.S. Lewis, but one of the reasons why he's a great apologist is that he was an atheist for most of his life, right? In other words, he knows how atheists think. He knows how they feel. He knows how they think. He knows what their arguments are. He lived that. He breathed that. And so then when he becomes a Christian, he can talk to those people. And a lot of times when Christians do apologetics with people who are non-believers, in my opinion, they're not very good. And it's not that they don't mean well, but they don't understand. They just don't understand how other people think, because they've been raised in the church, and maybe that's your experience. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, I have a heart for people who really think that they're close to God and are really far away. And basically, in my case, I didn't like the fact that people would lie to you. And lying was terrible. And then when I realized one day that I'm lying to myself for what I'm believing, I go, okay, something's got to change. But the question I have is if they at that time, especially for the 400 years, is it possible that there was a time where no true believers existed on earth?
Oh, sure. The question is it possible there was a time when no true believers existed on earth? Certainly.
Keep a remnant for himself somewhere, somehow? Or do we have ideas that there were zero?
I think that I deal with this a little bit with my ancient history students. It was very, very difficult for people to come around to the idea that there was just one God. That's why in the book of Exodus, when Moses encounters Yahweh at the burning bush, he says, if the people ask me who sent me, what should I say? Because he can't say God, capital G, because there's lots of gods. There's thousands of them. The question is, give me a name. So I am Yahweh, the God of your fathers, and so forth. So I think, in a certain sense, we should not assume that for most of the Old Testament, people were orthodox in the way that we think of today. Even if they believed in Yahweh, they probably weren't what we today would call orthodox. They had all kinds of other beliefs and values mixed in there. And that agrees with the history of the Old Testament, as the people of Israel are, so to speak, educated out of their polytheistic tendency. They can't get out of that. So was there ever a time when there were no Orthodox believers? I would say sure. The prophets, but if I taught a class in Jeremiah a little while ago, and Jeremiah's life was miserable. You get the idea that Jeremiah was the only Orthodox, or one of the few, in his whole nation. And it was one, Jeremiah contra mundum, against the whole world. He was incredibly opposed. So some of the prophets, and that's why they end up in our canon. I don't think the fact that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel are in our Old Testament is indicative of what most Israelites believed. I think it's indicative that we have the writings of a few remarkable people who suffered incredibly against huge odds. And only later, hundreds of years after they were dead, did people ever look back at their books and say, oh, they might have been onto something.
Did the prophets overlap each other enough so that there was a continual thread?
A little bit. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, certainly. Jeremiah probably, as a young man, would have heard Ezekiel, or I should, other way around. Ezekiel, as a young man, would have heard Jeremiah preach. There are certain passages in Ezekiel that I at least personally feel like he stole from Jeremiah. Isaiah is a little bit further back, and then you have a lot of the minor prophets, but the prophets were voices crying in the wilderness, and we use that language, you know. Most people didn't go with them. And in many cases, they didn't end out their days well. It wasn't like they died in a moment of victory with everybody coming around to their side. They fought to the end, and they died in obscurity and difficulty. But their writings were preserved. So that's important, yeah. I'm pretty much out of time, so to start the lesson, this was an intro lesson to Romans. We've talked a little bit about a wide range of big issues, and then specifically Paul. Next week, we're going to talk about the founding of the church in Rome. And then we'll talk, at the very least, about when did Paul write this letter? Why did he write this letter? What was he trying to communicate? And we'll see where we go from there. So welcome to the Romans class. And thank you, and I'll see you again in a week. And there's food downstairs. All right.